Part 2, Chapter 16. The Sharp Society office was located at number 3.5 Finch Street, like it had been forgotten until the last minute, and then squashed into what was meant to be an alley, hardly large enough to house a vast secret society. It had fewer windows and a narrower front door than the shops on either side. At its back, a factory belched black smoke at intermittent intervals. In the pale light of the early dawn, Loki could see a small hanging sign that read, B.A. Sharp, Antiquities. Though a bell over the door rang when Theo led Loki in, the shop looked deserted. Glass cases and shelves were bare, their corners collecting dust and cobwebs. The counter had begun to mold, where a drop of water from a leaky pipe overhead kept up a steady stream. Is the shop itself meant to be the antiquity? Loki asked. What? Theo looked up from fumbling to light a lamp. Oh no, it was Mr. Sharp's. We only use the back room now. Our office is through here. Come on. Theo led him around the corner, through a musty velvet curtain that smelled like the water had once been dripping on it before taking over the counter. This was barely an office. Loki was beginning to suspect they were barely a society. The back room, in contrast to the shop, was packed. Books were stacked to the ceiling. A heavy round table crowded into the center was sagging beneath the weight of papers and crates and one very rusty sword. A workstation had been shoved into one corner, wires and gears littering its top. As Theo took off his coat, Loki picked up a ring with an obviously fake jewel. The stone was pried away from the setting and propped up to reveal a set of miniature gears. Don't touch that, Leo said quickly. What does it do? Loki asked. It shoots darts, tipped in a sedative. Or it will, once it works. It's temperamental. Where did all this come from? Loki asked. Me, mostly. You made it? Some of it. I was an engineering student once. I was going to be an engineer as well, but that plan was rather ruined. He shrugged. It's probably all silly compared to what you have on Asgard. Yes. Theo cast Loki a glare from where he was pilling kindling into the stove. You're not supposed to agree with me. Loki shrugged. You said it. Yes, but mostly in the hopes that you'd raise some kind of protest. No, it's so impressive, worthy of Asgard, and you're wonderful and brilliant and handsome, Theo. He struck a match from a pack on the table and dropped it into the stove. It smoked, struggling to catch the kindling. Asking too much, I suppose. Loki picked up a set of tarnished gold gauntlets that looked more like something from his homeland than from Earth. What do these do? Theo glanced up from a second match. Nothing. They're antiques Mr. Sharp found on expedition. Mr. Sharp, the mysterious purveyor of the empty shop. Not so mysterious, Theo replied. Mrs. S.'s husband. He was an archaeologist. Collected Norse artifacts from the British Museum. They both were, him and Mrs. S. He was the one who made first contact with your father and Asgard, entirely by accident, after he found the fairy ring near Brookwood. Mr. Sharp, Loki repeated. Your daft society name makes so much more sense now. Theo snorted. You should petition to change it, so you have something less embarrassing to put on your calling card. Not handing out many calling cards these days. Theo blew onto the stove, then added, It's not much of a secret society if you go handing it about. Have you considered putting it to a vote? Loki asked, running a finger along the grimy windowsill. The many, many other members of your clearly enormous secret organization may be more likely to show up to your offices if you had a more fetching name. He glanced at Theo, who was chewing on his lips, staring intently down at his matchbook. It's a tribute, the name, Theo said. A tribute? To Mr. Sharp. I assumed. What happened to him? He died a few years back, Theo replied. Before I met him. You can't conjure fire, can you? Now that I've taken the cuffs off. He tossed the third blackened strike into the stove. It's bloody cold in here, and I can't get this to catch. Loki considered saying no. Theo did a dramatic shiver and chattered his teeth. Fine. Loki crossed to the stove, rubbing his hands together, partly for showmanship and partly because it was indeed frigid in the tiny back room, gathered a flame between his fingers and dropped it into the belly of the stove. The kindling roared to life, bathing him and Theo in a rosy, warm glow. Loki pressed his hands to the top of the stove, then glanced at Theo. What? That's... Theo ran a hand over his chin, and Loki suddenly felt strange, the way he'd always had on Asgard whenever his powers would manifest. But then Theo finished. That's brilliant! It's a simple spell. Yes, well, some of us can't do spells at all. Theo hung his cane on the back of the chair at the table and sank down into it, shifting the rusted sword off the stack of papers in front of him. Did you make those cuffs as well? Loki asked, baiting him, taking the seat across from Theo's and kicking his heels up against the stove. The magic-suppressing ones? No, those came from Asgard, Theo replied. Your father sent them to Mr. Sharp so that any magical beings he detained could stay detained. Apparently, there were a few incidents. It seemed to Loki that if you were enlisting humans to fight powerful magical beings on your behalf, the least you could do was arm them with the proper weaponry from the start. But before he could voice the thought, Theo pulled a stack of papers from the bottom of a tottering pile and began to fan them out over the table between them. So here are the police reports. Hold on. Loki clamped a hand over the top of the first report just as Theo reached for it, and for a moment their hands were smashed together. It was inelegant and unintentional. The brief feeling of skin on skin startled them both, though only Theo shied away, rubbing his hand like it had been burned. You promised to help me contact Asgard if I came with you to the morgue, Loki said. Did I? Theo rubbed the back of his neck. I remember it like it was yesterday. A pause. It was, in fact, a few hours ago. Yes, I recall, thank you. Theo heaved himself to his feet and retrieved a ceramic jug and bowl from a shelf by the workbench and placed it on top of the police reports. He uncorked the jug, then emptied the clear liquid from it into the bowl. This one is also from Odin. Ah, he gave you a jug of water? Loki pressed his hand to his chest. He's thoughtful, like that, my father. No, he gave us a bowl, Theo corrected. It works as a two-way means of communication between here and Asgard. Theo stepped back. The surface of the liquid shimmered, and from his angle, Loki could tell an image had formed, but he couldn't tell what it was. Would you like some privacy? Theo asked. Why? Can you hear both sides of the conversation? Why? Theo mimicked. Are you going to be talking about me? Possibly. Only disparaging things, I assure you. Theo snagged his cane off the back of the chair, cast a longing gaze at the stove, then called over his shoulder as he pushed through the velvet curtain. Tell your father I said hello. Loki bent over the bowl, its surface trembling slightly as though the ground below it was wavering. He had expected to see his father's council room reflected back, or Heimdall's observatory, perhaps even the throne room. At the very least, the map maker's offices or the library, the sort of places other dignitaries were shown when they visited or communicated with the Asgardian court. But instead, he found himself staring at blank stones that it took him a moment to realize made up a ceiling. It was so wholly unremarkable and unadorned, and there wasn't a chance it could be anywhere significant in the palace. Whatever place Odin had decided to accept communications from the Sharp Society, it was no place of honor. Loki felt a stab of anger at his father again for condemning him to this place, this embarrassment. Working with these humans, Odin couldn't even spare a corner of his council room for communications with. He'd never make contact with someone in Asgard in this dark, hidden corner of the palace. He'd be lucky if a boy emptying chamber pots passed. He straightened up, looking around for Theo. He considered going to fetch him to ask how it was they ever made contact with Asgard if this was all they had, or if there was some schedule for when a guard on patrol would pass by. Then something flashed on the surface of the water, and Loki dipped back to it, his nose nearly skimming the surface. Thor! A long pause, then the shuffle of footsteps, and a shadow fell over his line of vision. Blotting out the ceiling, it was Thor, his hair knotted and stringy with sweat, and his chest bare. He let out a shout of surprise. Loki! Please tell me you're wearing pants, Loki replied. What are you doing in a wash basin? Was that where he was? Worse than expected. Odin had banished all communication with the Sharp Society to the changing rooms off the training arena, where soldiers sparred. It was somewhere the king himself never went. What are you doing answering the call of a talking wash basin? Loki returned. Are you at the training fields? The changing rooms under them. You can't just... Thor shifted, grabbing a towel from somewhere outside Loki's line of vision and tossing it over his shoulder like he was trying to cover himself. What if I had been undressed? Then I would have been forever scarred, Loki replied dryly. Believe me, this isn't my first choice of location either. Thor rubbed the towel over his head, then tossed it onto the floor. He had been present. It would have taken a good deal. Had he been present, it would have taken a good deal of effort for Loki not to retrieve it. That won't dry if you leave it bunched up like that, he said. What? The towel. Did you appear here just to discuss my grooming habits? Could you have picked a more upsetting way to phrase that? Thor let out a huffy sigh, cast his eyes down at the towel, then seemed to make a conscious decision to be contrary and not pick it up. Where are you? He asked. On Midgard, Loki replied, where I was banished. You weren't banished, Thor replied indignantly. You're on an assignment. Loki gave him a saccharine smile. Ah, that's precious you believe that. Why aren't you on Alfheim? Father's gone alone, Thor replied. He's sending me a brigade to search for the stones at the smuggling port near Vanheim. One of our spies there thinks they might have passed into the black market. Loki almost fell forward into the basin in anger, and also a bit in the hope he'd fall straight into Asgard. Another heroic quest to add to your generous supply. He thought it would make a better use of my skills. Of course he did, Loki interrupted, and my talents are better used playing detective with humans. It's important work for a king, Thor began, but Loki cut him off. No, it's a waste of time meant to punish me. You have to get me out of here, Thor frowned. Call for Heimdall. I did. I think Father has told him not to bring me back. The Bifrost is closed to me. Then I shouldn't bring you back either. Loki realized he was gripping the side of the basin without meaning to. Brother, please. But your assignment. There is no assignment. Father made up some sham reason to get me off Asgard and to placate these pathetic humans to think what happens to them matters to us. Let me come with you to find the stones. I'd be so much more valuable to him there. He's out of the realm. He doesn't even have to know until I return with you. Thor chewed on the inside of his cheek, that familiar vein of consternation popping out in his forehead. I'm sorry, brother. Thor, please. I wish you luck with your assignment, and I'll see you when you return to Asgard. Thor! Loki shouted, but his brother was already gone. Then he came back just long enough to snatch up the towel he had discarded, fold it clumsily, and stalk away again. Loki fell backward into the chair, pressing his fists against his forehead and allowing himself a groan of frustration. He had, perhaps, exaggerated in saying that there was no reason for him to stay on Earth. Something magical truly was happening to these humans of London. But he didn't want to be the one to work it out. He wanted to be scouting the realms for the Norn stones with Thor, not in a room so narrow he could barely spread his arms, surrounded by human approximations of Asgard, and air so dry it made him itch. He wanted to be home. He wanted to be given a chance. Loki stood abruptly and pushed through the curtain, almost smashing into Theo, who was leaning against the counter directly across from it. What happened to privacy? Loki demanded. There was a curtain, Theo replied, the apples of his cheeks pink. Then he asked, almost like he couldn't help himself, So, we're pathetic humans that don't matter to your father, are we? Loki blew a long sigh through his nose. I'm sure the work you do is very important to your realm and its safety and balance and order and all those diplomatic vocabulary words. But you don't understand the grand scale of the universe. The biggest thing that happens on Midgard is a blip, a moment, the interdimensional equivalent of a sneeze. My brother is about to leave on an expedition across multiple realms to track down one of the galaxy's most dangerous magical amplifiers. So forgive me for not dictating all my energy to the death of a handful of humans in this goiter of a city. Theo's jaws clenched, and Loki sensed he wanted to say more than he did. Those people have families. Everyone has a family. That doesn't mean their lives don't matter. Oh, please, Loki snorted. Life is the opposite of precious and rare. It's everywhere. If you wept for every life lost who mattered, you'd weep until the world ended. They deserve justice, Theo pressed on, and the people here deserve to be safe from whatever it is that's killing them, as much as your people deserve to be safe from whatever artifacts your brother is searching for. All right, we are going to finish here. That is it for today, and I will see you guys next week. Thanks, guys.